Good morning. My name is Sarah, and I'm a research intern at the Center of Political Thought at the University of Exeter. This is my colleague Bingshu Zhao, who is a PhD candidate at the center. We are joined today by Dr. Sun Xiangchen, who has kindly agreed to interview with us regarding his academic work. Dr. Sun is a professor of philosophy and dean at the School of Philosophy, Fudan University, Shanghai. He received his bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees at Fudan University. His fields of study include early modern philosophy, enlightenment philosophy, political philosophy, Jewish Christian philosophy, phenomenology, and comparative philosophy. He has been a visiting scholar or an invited researcher at Peking University, Yale University, University of Birmingham, University of Chicago, Free University Berlin, École Normale Supérieure, and many other research institutions worldwide. He has recently published On Family, Individual, and Qin-Qin, which translates to Affection for Kin. His other major publications include Facing the Other, on Levinas Philosophical Thought, Political Philosophy and Sino-Theology, of which he was a co-author, Metaphysics of 17th Century, of which he was also co-author, and he is also the translator of the books Does God Exist? And Psychoanalysis and Religion. So welcome, Professor Sun.
Thank you.
In this interview, we will first talk with Professor Sun about his research interests and academic formation in philosophy. Then we will focus on some interesting questions regarding the interpretation of Chinese philosophy. In the third part, we will further explore his research on family, the philosophy of family based on his reflection on the Western tradition and Chinese philosophy in a comparative view. So, Professor Sun, first, we want to start by asking, how did you get interested in philosophy? And over your academic life, you have traveled extensively and visited various countries, universities, and institutions. So, we were wondering, to what extent and in what ways would you say that your research interests and approach have been informed or shaped by these worldwide and cross-cultural experiences?
Okay, thank you for your interview. It's a long story. When I was the middle school student, I have been studying in a boarding school. That means I have a lot of free time. So I read a lot of books, from novel to history and psychology and art books and aesthetics and philosophy. I found that philosophy is quite interesting. So the philosophy is my first choice, and history is the second. So at that time, I'm very interested in philosophy. But when I graduated from the undergraduate studies, I also went through a thought crisis, because I kept reading a lot of other philosophers' book, and very exciting. But I have my own idea. I don't know how to form my own philosophical idea. This is quite challenging for me. But because of my writing of the Wittgenstein's thesis, I know his discourse on the relationship between the riverbed and the river. So I can understand, the decisive role of the life form in philosophy research. So in this sense, I began to have some confidence, to know how to promote the philosophical research or study. I think that it's very important for me. And now my main philosophical interest is the cross civilizational understanding of the philosophical work. Just you mentioned, I have no experience like you of the study abroad. So I got my BA, MA, and PhD all get a degree at Fudan. but I have some root in a few root in different countries, the UK, US, Canada, Germany, Germany and France. So, I have some experience. I think the cross-culture understanding is quite interesting. Even within the Western world, there are still, different understanding of the same problems, and have a different tradition, analytical one, continental one, and even within the East Asia society, no matter from Japan or the Korea or China, they share some common culture, but at the same time they have a very different perspective to understand the whole world. So this is I think my experience, to how to lead me to study the cross civilization understanding of the philosophy. So also give me a very deep influence. I think it's quite interesting.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you, Professor Sun, for your answer, sharing with us this very exciting intellectual journey.
So, Professor Sun, in your article on how to interpret Chinese philosophy to the West, you recount your experience teaching Chinese philosophy in Berlin. And the title, How to Interpret Chinese Philosophy to the West, immediately made an impression on me for the particular use of interpreting to, which suggests something different to our conventional understanding of pedagogy. And conventionally, interpretation of the learning content may be a shared undertaking between the teacher and the pupil. And then later in your paper, while answering the question you pose on how to position Chinese philosophy properly, you speak of the task of a philosopher situated in the Chinese tradition to help their audience construct an ontological framework. And you would construct an ontological framework in the position of a guide to your students. And as such, this guide would enable the audience to interpret concepts from an unfamiliar epistemic tradition that may be separated from the audience linguistically and geographically. So I was intrigued by this, and I was wondering if you could explore with us your thoughts on whether proper interpretation of Chinese philosophy could be possible without a pedagogical relationship.
Okay, thank you. Very good question. Just as you mentioned, the teaching is a shared undertaking, but there are still, the different roles in this process. So otherwise, we do not need to distinguish between the teacher and the student. So in this sense, the teacher, I think maybe have the responsibility to give the students to explain his study, or the result of his study, and to help the student to try to understand, something difficult, or something it's alien to them. So of course it's also a critical process. It's also, I think this process is a benefit for both sides, the teacher and the students. But they have a different role, in this process. So in this sense, the teacher have more responsibility or to do something. This is the one part. Another one is, when I studied, the Chinese philosophy and Western philosophy, I think the most important thing is not, the difference in the detail, But first of all, we need some ontological framework. That is, it's important, and we need it, as human beings. Human beings have some, the commonality. This is the basic for our understanding. So we are human beings, so it's easy to understand. But different civilization, I think, they are emphasize different aspects of human existence. We have the same, the emotion, the rational is the same, but different civilization, they are focus, or they are emphasize, different aspects of the human existence. And then they are from different their own characteristics, of their civilization. So we have the commonality, and but there are still some difference. So first of all, we needed to understand the framework, for their understanding. Otherwise, we have a lot of difference, but it's not the scattered or the individual one. It's a holistic one. So that is important. Especially in this so-called postmodern. It's give big generation of all these things. It's there people are aware of it, but for the different civilization, I think the framework is very important. Otherwise, we will bring the others content into your own frame.
Yeah.
That will result in the deeply misunderstanding. So this is what I think is. So in this sense, this is what I want to emphasize. And you said if we have no such a relationship, the first of all is you help as a teacher or as a author. Maybe you will let your students or you let your readers have a fully consciousness or the how to say vigilance of the problem, the assumption or the premise of the problems they concern. So first of all, you have a very strong conscience or the vigilance, then of this premise or assumption, then you can have a good start, I think.
So following from the same point about creating a framework to invite, let's say, a foreign audience to the Chinese philosophical perspective, in the same article you refer initially to the Gadamerian position that to open oneself to others, one has to accept something against oneself. And then later in the same article, speaking from the perspective of a teacher, you say, only when you understand the horizon of the audience may your teaching be effective. So in light of the earlier reference to Gadamer, your use of the word horizon reminded me of Gadamer's ideal of understanding between two perspectives, which he names a fusion of horizons. So I was wondering to the extent to which this was relevant to your own thought, especially in terms of an outsider's understanding of Chinese philosophy being a process, not only of interpreting Chinese philosophy as perhaps a removed observer, but also in this course altering oneself in a spiritual way, maybe.
Yeah, thank you, and a very good question. And just you mentioned the Gadamer, first of all, when Gadamer says something about understanding or the dialogue, it's about the general dialogue or understanding. But for the across civilizational dialogue or understanding, I think a little bit different, because every just I mentioned, although we are human beings, we can understand each other, but a different civilization will focus or emphasize different aspect, of the human existence. In this sense, they formed the different framework. So this is the I think it's important, for us to understand each other for our mutual understanding. But you mentioned that the fusion of the horizon. Of course, for the task of philosopher, what they want to do is to reflect, the premise here. So then we discover, the fusion of the horizon, and the premise of the or the assumption of the fusion of horizon is that means we have a different horizon, we have a different perspective, and so theoretically we should to clarify different horizon or the premise or the assumption of the horizon. And otherwise, it's very easy. We will bring others' contents into your own understanding framework, and so that will result in the deeply misunderstanding.
Thank you. That's very insightful for me. Professor Sun, now let's move to the third part about your research on the philosophy of family. So in your research, you often return to the French Jewish philosopher Levinas. His critique of the Western philosophy and his idea of facing the others is somewhat kind of a starting point for your turn to Chinese intellectual tradition. So could you briefly outline the questions and problem you found in your reading of Western philosophy? Then what is the distinctiveness of family and Qin-Qin, the family feeling, in the Chinese philosophy as the foundation of an, as you said, existential structure? And how could this bring an alternative way of thinking about human life and human society, different from the Western tradition or traditions? Furthermore, your new book on family is subtitled Individual and Qin-Qin Affection for Qin, and puts forward these two values as a dual ontology. So could you tell us more about this meaning, why it's important to imagine the family in the modern world with this dual structure, and how to reconcile the individual and the family? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Yeah, and you mentioned Levinas. Levinas gave me a deep influence. Yeah, and why he is very important for me, because for the Levinas, he understanding the Western philosophy as a whole, from the outside, from the Jewish perspective, to try to understand the Greek tradition. So he go outside and then to reflect the whole Western philosophy. He always say, from the Parmenides to Heidegger, 2,000 years. Why he can draw such a conclusion? Because he said the Western philosophy, generally speaking, is an ontological tradition, so based on the being. So this gives me a great inspiration. In the Chinese language, we know such a word, like a being, equivalent to Western being. No such a word. I just mentioned to you there are maybe 5 or 6 translation of the ontology in Chinese translation of ontology, because they have a different the meaning. They use different Chinese word to translate the different meaning of the ontology. So Levinas is very important for me to give. Let me try to understand Western philosophy, from another perspective, or we say the detour, and then back to understand the Western philosophy. And this also let me try to to understand the Western philosophy from Chinese intellectual perspective. So this just it's my starting point to thinking about Chinese philosophy, reflect the promise of Chinese thought. So this is the reason why Levinas is important. The second you mentioned is
it was a special point.
Yeah. The special point is if we as Hegel said, the first category of Western philosophy is being. But if we want to understand Chinese philosophy, maybe the first category is not being. The first category is change, or the first category is the becoming. So if you can imagine, the whole system of the category is not based on the being, but based on the becoming. Maybe it's totally different. Yeah. So, and I think this is the totally different from the Western philosophy. And I also found that, such as being, Qin-Qin, or Philippiety it's also very important in Chinese philosophy, but maybe it's less important in Western philosophy. For example, in Western philosophy, there are many philosophical analysis, on the eros, the philia, agape. They are all the different kind of the love, but they are few. They only few an analysis on the affection for king, or the love between the parents and the children. But what is important in Chinese philosophy, Qin-Qin play a decisive role, in Chinese philosophy, in Chinese thought. So this is the way, from different perspectives under the Western philosophy, and then you can discover the Chinese characteristics. Yeah. So this is the reason why I focus on the Qin-Qin, the affection for king, on the family. So this is the reason. And what is the idea? Yeah, we mentioned that in my the subtitle of my book is the individual and the Qin-Qin. Yeah, I call it the dual core or the dual ontology. Yeah. That means just like you said, it's the fusion of the horizon. For the modern Chinese, there are no pure Chinese. In our daily life or the practical life, we have the different, we live in a modern world. At the same time, we also are Chinese. So in this sense, we have the dual horizon, dual core, and if we want to understand ourselves, one perspective is not enough. So we from the tradition, from the past, we still use the Chinese character, Chinese language, and we still the Chinese. But on the other hand, we live in a modern world, modern society, and we have the modern values. And how these two things put together, how they are mixed and fused. It's a interesting issues, and it's also a challenging issues. Yeah. And this is why I put these two different things, individual and Qin-Qin, together, and try to use these different perspectives to understand the family in the contemporary world. Yeah.
Oh, that's very interesting. Your philosophical thinking on families so clearly show that we are at the cross of the traditional and the modern, and the West and the Chinese. This leads us to the last question. So I would like to bring your work on family and the discussion on comparative philosophy together, and ask about the kind of response and reception of the philosophy of family in both China and the West. So you have published widely, calling for if I can say, rediscover and reconstruction of the family in the Chinese tradition at a philosophical level. So you also have been introducing and promoting a cross-civilizational dialogue between the Western and the Chinese philosophy. So I was wondering, how do you find this the response from those different academic contexts from each side? Are there any shared concerns, or you find just mainly different attitude? And would you say there is kind of an ongoing process of the reception of the philosophy of family? And if so, what do you think has contributed to that reception? To look beyond, the final question would be, how can we imagine the future of family in the modern world?
Frankly speaking, when I talk about the family, I don't think it's a popular topic for both, the Western people and the Chinese people. Family, it's a heavy burden, and but although it's not a popular topic, but they are resist this topic. I think they have different reasons. Maybe as far as the Chinese people is concerned, maybe they how to say it's a bondage. They bondage of the family. So they want to break free from the bondage of family, and so the family is too heavy. It's a big burden, for them. But for the Western people, maybe they are beware of the hierarchy or some hidden how to say the patriarchal patriarchal system. Yeah. So maybe the reason is different, but the family is not a popular topic. Yeah, and but there are still I think there's meaning in the modern world, the family, because the modern world is based on the individualism, and everything is based on your choice, your decision, and but then for the family they explore a different existential structure, such as the man and the male and the female, man, woman, and the different generation, parents, children, and brother, sister. So it's focused on the different relationships. It's not individual. So I think when Heidegger gave the analysis of the Dasein, is also just focused on the individual. But if you will say something about the family or the Qin-Qin, he can show us a different aspect of our life, the relation, and even the relationship between the different generations. So that is important. And so I give some different the concept, different from the Heidegger's. For the Heidegger, the being is being in the world. So it's not object and subject, it's being in the world. But on the other hand, I can say being not only in the world, being between the generations. So it's not only family, there are older generation, there are younger generation, young generation. So there are multiple generations. So that is also the important things in your life. And for the Heidegger, say being towards death, because everyone has his limitation. But according to being between the generations, the being not only towards the death, being towards the next generations, the children and the young generation, and that means the hope, the future for the human being. So in this sense, I think if we have such a perspective, we can have a different picture in our life. And but you mentioned the family in the future society. I think it's a big challenge. Now everything is based on our own decision. I know sometimes when children or a teenager, he or she use the word the non-binary. Not girl, not a boy. I'm not decision what I am. In this sense, the family a bigger problem in the modern world. But if we how to say that the paradigm shift, not focus on based on the individualism, but maybe in Chinese word we call it yin and yang, or male, female. Maybe we have a different picture of the our life. In this sense, I think family still have its value in the future society.
Oh, that's interesting. It's so striking for me to see the contrast between what you said, the Western, the idea of towards the death, and the idea in the book of change, the I Ching, the final image. The idea is to leave the future open. And with also the idea of endless procreation in the generational relations. Well, thank you, Professor Sun, for this fascinating discussion. We look forward to hearing more about your research and work in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.